You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is HARDtalk with me, Stephen Sacker. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. My guest today is a groundbreaker, the first black Briton to run one of the country's regional police forces. Michael Fuller served a total of 3.5 decades as a police officer, mostly in London. He's been a beat officer, detective, lead officer in operations against armed gangs, and a long-time advocate of making the police service more diverse and more rooted in its communities. While fighting crime, he's also had to overcome systemic racism inside his own organisation and accusations from within the black community that he was a sellout and a traitor. He's now retired from the police and had time to reflect on 4 decades in which attitudes to policing, to race, and to community cohesion have undergone significant change. He's written a memoir titled "Kill the Black One First." To what extent has race defined his remarkable career? Well, Michael Fuller joins me now. Welcome to HARDtalk.
Thank you.
I want to begin with a personal question, a character question. It seems to me, in all of your life, from childhood through to adulthood and your many decades of service in the police force, you are a man who is used to swimming against the tide. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. That's partly being in the minority. So at the time I started in the police, there were only 6 black officers. This was back in 1977. When I joined, and it was something I always wanted to do, and my book describes my passion for joining the police. But I was very much in a minority, and it was very unusual to see a black officer in London.
You mentioned the book. It's a fascinating, honest memoir. Kill the Black One First, it's rather ominously called. But you forensically go through your own childhood as well as your policing career. And what we learn is that your ambition in childhood to be a policeman was something that your own family, your father in particular, found it very difficult to deal with.
Yes, I think the thing is, the book's designed to be inspirational. So the title comes from something that was shouted at me at the Brixton riots in 1981. And the prologue talks about the dilemmas I faced in terms of which tribe do I belong to? Do I belong to this tribe of police officers who are using racist language? Or do I belong to the people outside the bus who are black youths who hate the police? And it created a big dilemma and a paradox for me, as you can imagine.
Well, I can imagine it, and I want to talk about how you felt on that anti-riot police line in Brixton, because it seems to me a sort of seminal moment for you. But before we even get there, I want to go back to your father, because you write this, you say, when you announced as a kid, I'm going to be a policeman, my dad and his friends, they stared at me as if I'd announced I wanted to be an axe murderer. One of them choked on his rum. And then they started to talk all at once. Didn't I understand, they asked, that the police were our enemy?
Yes, I think I was a bit naive and blind to the hatred that was felt by the black community at that time. And we're talking about late 70s, and we're talking about the Windrush generation, who told me how they'd been treated by the police, and the fact that there was lots of prejudice, discrimination. A lot of the Windrush generation felt they'd been poorly dealt with by the police, either being stopped in their cars, stopped on the streets, unnecessarily stopped and searched, and there was huge resentment. But I didn't let that put me off. I was passionate about joining the police, and in my childhood I'd been very keen on sleuthing, solving crimes. You know, that was still something I wanted to do, and I wasn't deterred by people saying don't do it.
There's one other crucial element in your childhood I think we should mention, and I wonder if it's relevant to your ambition to be a police officer, and that is that your parents didn't feel able to raise you themselves. They put you into a council-run care home, which I believe was, frankly, it was run by white people.
Yes.
So you were raised effectively, mostly, by white people.
Yes.
And I wonder if, on reflection, you feel that gave you a different perspective on society from many of the young black kids that were your contemporaries at the time.
It may have given me a different perspective, but I think much of the story, and my story, is born of experience, in that, yes, I was brought up by somebody called Margaret Hurst, who the book is dedicated to. She's white. She was effectively a role model to me. She was very encouraging about me joining the police. If that was something I was passionate about doing, then her view was I should go ahead and join the police, regardless of what other people said, and follow my passion. And I'm glad I did. But you can imagine lots of other people were concerned that I might experience racism.
Yes, and so let us go back to that police line in 1981. There you are staring at the rioters. They weren't just black rioters, but there was a lot of young black males who were involved in the Brixton riots. They shouted at you. Some called you coconut,
Yes.
which is an offensive term, which means you're black on the outside, but you're basically white on the inside.
Yes.
I think you were accused of being a sellout and a traitor.
Yes.
How alone did you feel at that point?
Well, I felt very isolated, and I felt that I didn't belong either to that group of police officers, and I certainly didn't belong to those people who, it was the first time after being shouted, "Kill the black one first." The person who shouted that made this rather strange laugh, and I thought, well, maybe he's just joking. And the next thing is I heard a smash of glass, I smelt petrol fumes, and then the flames just shot up in front of me, and the other officer who was beside me, who had his beard singed. I mean, neither of us were injured, but it's quite a shocking experience, and it's very new to Britain. We hadn't had riots before, and certainly hadn't seen this hatred towards the police. The previous day I'd been helping people who are poor and marginalised, people who are victims of crime, child abuse. I've been helping people who suffered from alcohol addiction, drug addiction, helping old ladies. And, the next day I was actually facing these very angry individuals on this riot. It was quite a shocking experience.
One of the interesting elements of that answer was that you said you didn't feel you belonged on the police line, or indeed with the rioters either. And this question of belonging is very complex for you.
It is.
I just wonder why you persisted with the police, and you did in a 3.5 decade long career, when you patently didn't feel you were accepted or belonged for much of your career. And you've itemized the systemic, nasty, persistent racism that you faced from your fellow officers, white men and women in the force, not over just the beginnings of your career, but throughout much of your career.
Well, I always felt that either through naivety or otherwise, that I could change things for the better on the inside and persuade people about the right thing to do. So one of the things I did do when we had a disproportionate number of black officers leaving the police, that I set up with others the Black Police Association, and I was the founding chair, and that was seen as quite a radical organisation, particularly for the police, because there was already a union that was representing police officers, albeit police officers aren't allowed to have a union. But I set up this staff association of black officers, and the idea was it was a support organisation and designed to stop these officers leaving, because they were leaving in droves.
But did it make any difference? Because again, you describe situations in police canteens and other environments surrounded by fellow officers where the N-word was used and then covered up afterwards when you made official complaints, where people would mock you with sort of shouts of bananas every time they went past your office door. Once at a police function, a comedian saw you and described you as a spear chucker. I mean, this was humiliating, utterly humiliating.
Yes, I mean, there were lots, and obviously I've illustrated lots of humiliating occasions. But I mean, clearly, not everybody was racist, and clearly there were a lot of people who supported me.
Were there?
Yes, there were a lot of people who supported me in my journey from the bottom of the police as a cadet making tea to get to the very top and become a chief constable. So without that support, without that encouragement, I would not have made it, and I would have left.
If we follow the chronology of your career, before we get to your promotion, and it was a huge thing to be the first county director of a police force in the UK, Chief Constable of Kent. Before we get there, you were in the Metropolitan Police at an extraordinarily sensitive time. After the totemic murder of the young black man, Stephen Lawrence, a teenager, who was stabbed to death by a group of white youths in South London in 1993. The fallout from that lasted for many years, and it raised deeply disturbing questions about the failings of the police to properly investigate that murder. You were inside the Met. Were you aware yourself of how the police were failing?
Yes, I was, yes. And I actually wrote an article when Judge McPherson had talked about the police being institutionally racist.
Which was the key moment. After all of the failings of the police, a senior official was appointed to investigate, and his report, the so-called McPherson report, referred to the institutional racism inside the Metropolitan Police. You, as one of the senior black officers in the Metropolitan Police at the time, you must have felt very conflicted.
I was very conflicted, but I was very keen the force, the police, address the criticisms that have been made. And institutional racism is a very hard concept to grasp. You know, the idea that you could unintentionally be biased, unintentionally be prejudiced, was very difficult for most officers, including myself, to understand and grasp. I wrote articles for police magazines, I was interviewed by police magazines, and that's described in the book, explaining what this racism was that we were being accused of. And of course the Stephen Lawrence murder investigation and the evidence highlighted by the judge showed there had been prejudice in the way that that investigation had been handled and dealt with. And that I was very keen that a lot of those issues be put right. I wrote an action plan for the Met. I suggested setting up a racial and violent crime task force. I suggested that racially motivated crime be dealt with and investigated in the same way as any other crime. And of course at the time that was seen as groundbreaking. Doesn't seem so now, but I mean at the time it was groundbreaking.
Well, the question to ask now is whether, when you look at the Metropolitan Police and the British police forces generally today, do you believe that if McPherson were to come back and report again, he would still find institutional racism?
Well, I think there's some improvements, albeit I have spoken to officers who are currently serving, and we're talking black officers who are currently serving, and they say, well, they feel there's still racism there. But, I mean, the thing that exists now is there are sanctions in the way that for racist conduct and racist behaviour by police officers, that there weren't specific sanctions.
But the numbers...
at the time I was serving as a junior officer.
Yes. I mean, if one draws conclusions from the raw data and the numbers, if you look at the higher levels of the police, senior officers, I think it's still 3% or less of senior officers are black, Asian or minority ethnic. Now, given that the overall proportion in the population of BA, ME people in the UK is around 13%, suggests there is still a profound problem.
Yes, and I'd agree with that. There is still a profound problem, and there hasn't been a black chief constable appointed since I left. And I can't understand why. I've asked why not. And there's certainly people who are talented and capable of performing the role that I performed in Kent, but it hasn't happened.
And you, at the time, I've looked back at the press reporting of your rise through the ranks to lead the Kent Constabulary. There was a lot of talk at the time that you might be the first chief constable, commissioner, as they're called, of the Metropolitan Police, the biggest job in British policing. The first, it would be a very symbolic moment if it had happened. It didn't happen. Why not, do you think?
Well, I think that's for others to answer, really. I would have been happy to do the job. I certainly would have been capable of doing the job. I mean, I qualified as a lawyer and I followed and pursued a different career. But I think it's for others to answer that, and others to answer as to why there haven't been any other black chief constables appointed since I left. I
said at the introduction to this interview, Britain right now is wrestling with an alarming rise in knife crime. Now, you had to wrestle with violent crime in the black British community as a senior officer. Operation Trident was your operation, operating against a gang culture and use of guns in inner city London. Do you think the fact that many black people then, and maybe still today, have a problem with the police is a huge problem in effectively policing the inner city?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that knife crime is rising at a faster rate outside of London, so outside the urban areas. So it's a problem throughout the UK, and that it's a problem that needs to be tackled. Now, the thing we learnt on Operation Trident was that you had to have support of the community in tackling the problem at the time was gun crime. And the reason for that was that once you actually catch perpetrators of the violence, whether it's knife crime or other violent crime, you need witnesses, you need people who are going to come forward and give evidence against very violent people. Now, if the police alienate potential witnesses and alienate the public, then clearly you're not going to get the public support. What we found on Trident was that when we set up the operation, I took 18 months in setting it up, having spoken to community groups about what I was trying to do and the fact I was sincere in trying to reduce the problem of gun violence in London, that having explained to people what I was going to do and why, that we got huge public support and we were inundated with intelligence, over 3,000 pieces of intelligence when we started our operation, and we were able to create a top 10 list of criminals that we wanted to capture who were responsible for multiple murders. And we actually took 4 years, but we actually captured all those individuals as well as lots of other people. We also, with the intelligence, we recovered guns, we recovered knives, and people went to prison as a result.
So in that answer, you're suggesting to me that the key to focus on is intelligence gathering within the community and working with the community. You didn't mention anything about police numbers in that answer, but as you know right now, the political hot potato is whether the reductions in police numbers that we've seen in recent times, and Theresa May, the Prime Minister, says there is no causal link with crime levels and police numbers. Many others disagree.
Well,
From your experience on the ground, are police numbers relevant or irrelevant?
Yeah, I mean, police numbers are highly relevant. I mean, one of the things in tackling any type of violence is that there needs to be consequences. So in terms of knife crime, those who carry knives, those who are involved in knife violence or gang violence, need to know that there are consequences and fear being caught. And clearly, if there isn't the police presence that there should be, then the people involved in the crime won't feel that there'll be any consequences in carrying a knife and actually using it. And I think that's the problem you're seeing at the moment.
Do you think it's problematic then when Theresa May says that there is, and I'm quoting her directly, no direct correlation between the rise in knife crime and the fall in police numbers?
Well, she's probably commenting on the stats, but I would disagree personally, and that clearly I don't see the police presence as somebody who's lived in London for 40 years, and the police response is worse than it ever was. I regularly call out the police to incidents, fights and things I've seen, and the police response has been a lot slower and poorer than it used to be. And the explanation that's given to me by the police officers is they just haven't got the numbers.
When you were a beat officer in London, you were involved in what has become known as stop and search operations, where you would target particular communities because of the data you'd seen on rising crime or particular crime problems, and you would stop people on the suspicion that they may have committed a crime or be carrying a weapon or whatever. The LSE has just done a study on this. The figures suggest that there is now a new spike in the use of stop and search powers by the police, and it is disproportionately being used against black people.
Yes.
8.4 times the rate of white people in terms of who is being stopped. Now, there are voices in the black community, including Trevor Phillips, who's an influential voice because he used to head up the Equality and Human Rights Commission, saying that's a good thing. And we shouldn't be embarrassed to say that because perpetrators and victims, and many inner city areas are largely black, we should be using stop and search primarily against black people in these communities. Do you agree?
Well, I think what's important is the criminality, really. I don't think racial profiling or introducing racial element to criminality is actually very helpful. Certainly on Operation Trident, what we found was successful was having community support. We had a hotline. People told us who were carrying the guns. We didn't care what colour they were. If they were carrying guns, they were engaged in crime, they were doing harm to other people, involved in drug dealing, then my view is that they should be arrested regardless of what colour they were. And that we've seen the problems, certainly in Kent, where there were very few black people. I mean, there were very similar problems of violence. If you look at the town centres on a Friday or Saturday night, you'll see violent crime happening right in front of your eyes outside some of the public houses. So
no, understood.
It's not a problem that's peculiar to London.
Indeed it's not.
And it's not a problem that's peculiar to black people.
Indeed it's not. I totally take that point. But Trevor Phillips says this. He says police officers should be in certain situations exempt from race discrimination laws in order to target black youths in high crime areas where the crime, according to the data, is being committed by black youths.
I don't agree with that. I think police officers should work within the law. We were able to do that in tackling one of the most serious and difficult crimes of gun violence. We were able to tackle it successfully, reduce the problem, so much so that the operation I set up after 4 years, that the Commissioner of the day said, well, the level of gun violence now doesn't justify this big operation and that we're going to scale it down. And I recommended it be scaled down, but not actually got rid of. So the point is that we were able to successfully tackle a problem of violence by using targeted stop and search, so stopping people who we knew, we had good intelligence, were involved in the violence. Gang members, we dealt with drug dealers, and some of the violence that we're seeing now is associated with drug markets, and people involved in drug dealing can't be surprised that they're stop and searched by the police. But I mean, to actually narrow it down to race and profile, or try to profile people racially, is a very narrow way of looking at the problem.
Let me ask you a personal question. You came from a difficult background. We've discussed how your parents put you into care, you were raised in a care home, had lots of reasons, it seems to me, to be angry and resentful. And we know that in many situations, many young people who've had difficult backgrounds, disadvantaged backgrounds, do end up angry, resentful, and sometimes committing crimes and socially abusive behaviours. You absolutely didn't. You chose to join the police and to be, in a sense, the ultimate conformist. What do you think made you different?
Well, I mean, when people say you came from a difficult background, it didn't seem difficult to me. It didn't seem disadvantaged. I didn't know I was disadvantaged. I didn't know any different, other than the fact that I'd rather have been with my parents rather than in a children's home. But the actual experience in the children's home, and the person who brought me up, Margaret Hurst, who was a white woman, she was very loving. She set very clear boundaries.
I guess what I'm asking is a very simple question in the end, which is, reflecting on a long career in the police force and reflecting on the links between criminality and environment, are you now a man who believes that those who choose to indulge in criminality are driven more by nature or nurture?
I think I was a product of my upbringing, really, and the fact I was brought up by somebody who was very loving, set very clear boundaries for me, taught me the difference between right and wrong, and I had positive dealings clearly with the police. And the police officers in my life were role models and were very positive individuals that I think men, particularly young men, need. You need good, strong male role models. My experience was a good one, and I loved the policing. I didn't like the racism. I wouldn't have done anything else. And I'm glad that I ignored all those people, including friends, teachers, and my mother, my natural mother and father, who I didn't live with. They all told me not to join the police, and I'm just so pleased that I ignored them, because I had a wonderful career and wonderful opportunities, and I wouldn't want other people to be deterred from doing something that they're passionate about.
It's a good place to end. Michael Fuller, thank you very much indeed for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Has it ever crossed your mind that the bicycle was partly responsible for the emancipation of women? And where would we be without the humble pencil, or glass, or for that matter, GPS? I'm Tim Harford, and I host the 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy podcast for the BBC World Service. We're about to launch our second season. That's 50 more episodes, 50 more inventions and ideas that made the world what it is today, from bricks and beehives to the mail order catalogue and even Facebook's like button. We're launching this season alongside 30 Animals That Made Us Smarter, a fascinating new podcast that looks at how humans trying to solve technological problems have been inspired by the animal kingdom. So that's 30 Animals and 50 Things. Just search for 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy and 30 Animals That Made Us Smarter wherever you found this podcast.